Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and we've had Schalke, or the Flame of Xulta, out for a week, which is gonna be it's been a pretty delightful time. We've been really enjoying ourselves. The meta seems really great. The main thing that's really been really nice has been Expeditions. Like, basically, Eternal has been pretty desperately in need of rotations. Expeditions has previously not been like a very playable format with good matchmaking or anything like that. Right now, it seems like the matchmaking is actually working correctly. We have some online tracked leaderboards that are going to become real leaderboards at the end of this month. Fingers crossed. So yeah, like with any luck, we are going to be seeing some pretty good stuff. And we also have an official tournament format in Expeditions, meaning that Expeditions is quickly becoming the main format. And it really needs to be, because ranked is still not that great an environment. But we are really happy to see like all of these new cards, and we're really happy to play with all of these new cards. I will say that Expeditions has been so much fun in the first week. I've actually enjoyed it. It really reminds me of Set 1 Eternal, which is one of my favorite sets in Eternal. Like, there were a lot of really good releases, and it's going to be neat to build on these Expeditions and play around with different types of formats. But like, overall, the lower power format combined with like really interesting cards and really interesting mechanics. Like, all of the mechanics in this set have been smash hits, and we've been really enjoying them. Like, basically, there's just a lot of really cool stuff happening here, and also, like, I would say a more thoughtful, kind of magic-oriented approach, a little bit further towards the MTG side of things in terms of complication and difficulty and hard choices to make and just sort of general decision making. All of which is leading to just a fantastic set in general. So we're going to be talking about cards. We've gone over all the legendaries so far, and now we're going to be talking about fire cards to start. And we're going to go over each of them in turn, talk about where they might be used. We're going to have some general impressions on them. Usually the way that I sort of measure cards is based on like what we can use them in. And so like if they're available and they're good for something, we'll talk about that. But I also will say if something is going to be in like a tier 1 deck, which is to say a deck that is very likely to be showing up in like a tournament, or like is just something where you are going to be grinding, seeing it on the grind all the time because the card is just too powerful, and like it's going to be something that you actually see, you have access to in a wild variety of places. This is really notable because we have a difference between ranked and expedition here. There are a lot of cards in this format that are very good in expeditions that are not as good in ranked, and figuring that out is still a little bit up in the air, but we are going to be talking about both expeditions and ranked in terms of where these cards have value. Alright, so first things first, we're leading with Emblem of Schalke, and leading with the emblems is going to be an interesting one. Let me actually go into crafting here and also set this up slightly different so that we can actually see all the cards in order. Yeah, there we go. Emblem of Schalke. So yeah, gain a fire, take a damage, decimate. If you have 3 fire, you create and draw a 3/3 Ash Elemental with Overwhelm. So notably, you can play this card as early as 2 and still play the Ash Elemental with Overwhelm if you have a way to get extra red influence out of it. So you could, for example, replace your Evangel with a 3/3 Ash Elemental with Overwhelm for your turn 2 play if your Schalke Evangel does in fact have given you that red, because you can then decimate immediately and play a 2-drop even if your power has dropped to 1, because you get to keep the power that you decimate when you play it. So yeah, with decimate essentially reducing your maximum power by 1 and giving you that big start, or basically taking away your future, you probably don't want to do that. And at 3, it's still not that great an idea because there's pretty good 4-drops and there's pretty good 5-drops to be leaping to. This is a card that sort of happens to be very good flood protection in later periods of the game because it gives you an easy unit to play while also giving you additional influence to build towards other things. So for your flash fires and your other types of setups, if you're playing big red stuff, like this is power that turns into a unit, and the unit is reasonably useful and functions as something like a 2-cost 3/3, which is definitely not too bad, although the extra power loss is kind of a big deal and is something of a punishing format. I will say that of the emblems, this one seems like one of the stronger ones, mostly because red is the color that most wants to do decimations like this, specifically where you are sacrificing your maximum power in your power slot to actually get more units. Like, this is a really well statted unit for what kind of stuff it does. The main risk here, of course, is that you're taking self-damage, so if you're doing a lot of trading, you can do some interesting things there. I have opinions on the emblems that I think are somewhat contrary to what other people are sort of saying. Like, everyone that I've seen so far has basically been saying that emblems are really powerful powerful, just like no holds barred, like every deck wants them. I don't think that's true. I think these are very specifically for more aggressive types of decks that want both undepleted power and the ability to have a monument later in the game, and there aren't actually that many decks that want that. There may be some, but like also the damage that you take from it is definitely a little bit real, and there's also a lot of things in ranked where you specifically want to have some seats available for undepleted power, or you want to have a little bit more of flexibility on that front. I don't think that emblems are bad. I think you definitely should be running them in quite a few decks, but I am also of the opinion that they're a little bit more dangerous than people are giving them credit for, and so use them with caution. But all the same, in both Ranked and Expedition, this card is very, very strong. You play it in aggressive decks that don't really want to go to 7 or 6 drops or anything like above 6, and then you can just do nasty, ridiculous things, and you won't flood out as often, which is very, very good. And it plays very well with other things, as long as you aren't playing seats, like you've got good power base off of this. The main thing that you have to worry about is the extra damage from it, which does matter, and means that you need to be able to play some sort of like lifesteal or other things like that, or you need to be playing mono fire so aggressive that it doesn't mind taking an additional 2 to 3 damage in a game against another player that is also playing a similar deck. That's an important thing to note, but overall, the emblems are really, really strong. These cards are very, very good. You should take them in drafts, you should take them in expeditions, you should take them in ranked, because they're all good in all 3 of those formats, and in draft in particular, they're just really, really solid to pick up. All right, Edict of Schalke. 1-drop spell. Edict of Schalke can't be negated or blocked by Aegis. Deal 1 damage to an enemy. Note that this includes sights. And if it's green or blue, deal 5 damage to it instead. This is the first of a cycle of color hate cards that only hate outside of their own colors. I like this form of color hate a lot better than other cards that we've seen so far. Like, I was never a big fan of In Cold Blood, which was a card that specifically shut down Justice, and while Justice rapidly became like the most hated form of cards, and In Cold Blood became like a thing that you could definitely run against that type of setup, it was still along the lines of like, it just really wasn't Justice's fault, and like I just didn't like the design of In Cold Blood very much. Edict of Schalke is a lot more on brand. First off, it is a 1-drop that deals 1 damage, so it's effectively a snowball, and snowballs are playable cards. Like, you don't feel too bad about having a snowball that can't be negated or blocked by Aegis, because you can kill a number of interesting things with that, and you can damage sites and do other ridiculous nonsense. So very, very good on that front just right away. Like, even if you don't have a green or blue thing to hit, Edict of Schalke is going to be able to at least do something, influence the board in some way, cause a little bit of damage. So you can run this main board and not feel too bad about it. Now, the really good thing about this is that it basically slams almost every site on the board. It doesn't hit Xenon Temple, and it doesn't hit Praxis Arcanum, and it doesn't hit a couple of others that are very specifically not green or blue. But there's a lot of green or blue sites, so this is a card that very well kills those things. Also is very good against all sorts of hot nonsense. The most notable one is that this is a card that at 1 kills Ikaria immediately through its Aegis, just like, yeah. This is the most powerful of the edicts, I would say right now. Like, this is just very, very good. It is really, really flexible. It plays well against a number of different cards. It is good in the type of format that you want. It is extra damage to an enemy. You can use it on your opponent's face. You can also use it on their relic weapons to deal extra damage to their face. Like, there's just a wild amount of things that this card can be used on. It removes every single type of, like, offensive card. You can get sights, you can get relic weapons, and you can get your opponents. Or you can get your opponent's units. So yeah, wild amount of things that this card can do. It's really, really flexible. It's a solid draft pickup in general, just because like you want damage spells there, and like it does actually synergize well with damage spells, which other edicts do not. And then also it's just like really, really powerful in a wide variety of other things. This is the new Torch of the format, actually. It's not quite as good as Torch, but in many ways it is better than Torch. And those ways that are important are like really, really relevant. So yeah, this card's very strong. It's also very pretty. Love the card art on this one, and it's just, yeah, really, really powerful card. Pick it in basically everything. It's not as good in ranked as it is in expeditions and draft, but I would say that it's fine in ranked, and certainly something that you would at least want to market, if not main board. Breath of Oprex. Deal 5 damage to an enemy unit unless the enemy player chooses to take 5 damage instead. Alright, so basic card design. If a card says unless the enemy player chooses, it is usually a trap. You are not generally going to want to play these cards or pick these cards in draft unless you have a really specific plan that requires the opponent to make the bad choice. If you can manage that, cards like Breath of Voprex are good. In general, and very much in this case, cards like Breath of Voprex are very bad. So the main thing that is the problem with this is that even though the stats on it are very good, you are effectively looking at 5 damage to the enemy face, which would be delightful if you were playing a burn deck, or 5 damage to an enemy unit for 2, which is mediocre but still pretty good for 2 on a fast spell in red. So the main problem with this is that it is never the card that you want it to be at the time that you want it to be it. So if you are trying to kill a unit that absolutely needs to die in order to basically cause problems, like, it's just not going to work out very well. Like, you just aren't going to get the value that you want out of it. Like, you're not going to get the unit because your opponent's going to take the damage to the face. In most instances, if you Breath of Voprex on anywhere from turn 2 to turn 10, your opponent's going to take 5 damage to the face rather than take damage to the enemy unit, or they should be doing that if they want to make good choices in life. So yeah, that's a problem because you basically can't kill a unit with it. You also can't play it on their face if they don't have units, which is pretty important. And then later in the game, when you actually want it to hit their face and you don't care so much about their units, they can just choose to deal the damage to their units, or they can even have big units on board that are too big for Breath of Voprex to hit. It's a real problem. This card is borderline unplayable in most of the situations. It's even bad in draft formats, despite the fact that it has extremely solid stats. But like, yeah, there's a lot of problems with this card. It's one of the weaker cards in the set just because of that enemy player chooses ability. That being said, if you are an aggressive deck, if you are putting a lot of pressure on your opponent and you are usually getting them to the point where they are very, very low on options and health late in the game and you need closers, cards like Breath of Voprex actually do work. You can play them fairly late in the turn, somewhere around turn 4 or 5, at the point where your opponent actually has something like 7 health and a small 2/2 blocker or something like that, at which point they either have the choice of taking 5 damage to the face, which will almost certainly kill them, or losing their blocker, which will almost certainly kill them. In those instances, Breath of Voprex is both efficient and powerful, and that's where you play it. To that extent, Breath of Voprex may belong in a ranked deck. It might belong in an expedition deck, but I very, very much doubt it. It almost certainly does not belong in a draft deck. However, keep in mind that if you can double the damage on this card, you can get a little bit more value out of it and at least kill the unit that you want to kill, because most people are going to take 10 to the face in order to avoid losing a 5-drop unit or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot happening here. This card's very bad, but keep in mind that it can be used to generate an effective burn deck that you can actually do some interesting things with. It's the kind of choice that you can use, provided you can manipulate the enemy player into using that choice ineffectively. But in general, don't pick this card unless you have a really, really specific plan. Desperate Gambit. Give one of your units +2/+1 this turn. Decimate. Give an additional one of your units +2/+1 this turn. So this card is not playable in ranked, and it's probably not amazing in expeditions. It at least has the ability to activate masteries in expeditions, and that's something that you kind of want to have access to. Still, it's a lot weaker on stats than a Finest Hour, and overall, there's a lot of better options, even in expeditions, for what you want to do. This is a pretty good draft card. It's a reasonable fast spell that gives you a little bit of extra oomph. Most of the masteries early on in the game tend to involve accomplishing around 4. There's a lot of mastery 4, and there's a lot of mastery like 1 to 2. So this card will activate most masteries in the game in an even trade, while also giving your unit the extra health it needs to survive in an even trade, which people will often go for even trades against mastery units because they're the kind of units that really invite you to trade with them. Like, it's really, really hard to not block a mastery unit if it's going to get its mastery or if it's going to build on that mastery. So yeah, Desperate Gambit really works on that front. If you're playing with a decent amount of mastery cards, you can also decimate it to get an extra card's worth of value out of it in better situations. But most of the time, you just use this as a pretty simple trick that will also get you a little bit of an extra bonus. As a draft card, I wouldn't pick it super highly, but it's still a fast spell trick, and fast spell tricks are very powerful in this format, as well as in most limited formats. And by the way, in draft, we are often talking about sealed as well. But yeah, like, I would say that this card is reasonable in that format. In Expedition, not so high on it. The Decimate's not very powerful. It's in the wrong colors for Decimate to matter for Decimate Matters decks, and it's a little too low on stats to do anything else. But maybe in like a green, yellow, red Mastery deck, you could do something along those lines. In Ranked, definitely not. Schalke Evangel, Berserk Fate, Gain of Fire, 2/2. This is one of the more interesting ones of the cycle of Evangels, all of which gain 1 influence in a form of your choice. Doesn't gain power, but gives you a decent unit for 2 that also happens to be doing some other things. I like a lot of things about this card. I like that Fire got a Berserk unit while Time got a Charge unit. I think that's an interesting change-up that actually really works well with the both the design of Eternal's color pie and like sort of just varying up what we were doing with each of these cards. I think this is a pretty good common for any sort of common-based aggro deck because it fixes your power, and like that is actually really, really important. Like fixing your influence is really useful if you want to get access to even like a dual color deck. You can do some pretty decent things with it. But yeah, this card is reasonably okay. Definitely plays okay in Expeditions. It's not powerful enough for Ranked just on the overall value of it, but there are some potential shenanigans you can get away with it. Notably, the extra fire influence on it builds in the same way that you might build off of a Praxis Stranger, where you can get like really good flash fires out of the setup, but like a Praxis Stranger, it's only 1 card, and you have to actually have the card to get the flash fire, so it doesn't really measure out any better than Praxis Stranger in that respect, other than the fact that you can play other cards before it, which is a big improvement over Praxis Stranger, actually, because if you are trying to get like some really aggressive cards out that require deep red influence. I've talked before about how hard it is to get deep red influence at turn 2 or turn 3. This is the kind of card that allows you to basically trade a better card in and then come out with this later on and then stick something big on it with Berserk. I like this card very well. Of the Evangels, it may be the strongest. I'd have to think about that for a second. Kodash Evangel is very, very close with its lifesteal ability. It's really, really solid. The Berserk ability here works very well with a lot of other things. Overwhelm, not so great. Charge, decent. Definitely on par with Schalke Evangel in terms of like overall scaling. But like I said, with Evangels, you often don't want to play them on 2. You just want to play other cards with them by fixing with them from drawing them into your hand. If you do play it on 2, you're a little less happy than you are with, say, a 2/2 with Charge, but I think that overall this is a card that really plays decently on 3 or 4, and that kind of scaling makes it a little bit more interesting in fire decks in general. Evangels are not terribly playable in Ranked, but the fixing on them is very, very nice, which does help you out quite a bit. In Draft, they are pretty important picks because you need fixing for your colors. I would say these cards are very high picks, not so high as removal or like bombs, but definitely along the lines of like these are the types of color fixing that you need to really set up hands where you don't lose. Like if you don't want to get screwed by the power system, these are the kind of cards that are designed to help you out. You want to pick them very highly in drafts so that you don't get any unlucky loses on your way to your 7 wins. So good stuff. Soul's Fury, sacrifice a unit to deal 4 damage to an enemy. There's a lot of things this card can be used for, but I'm generally not fond of it. It is a worse design than Consuming Flames, which is a 2-cost fast spell that sacrifices a unit to deal 3 damage to an enemy. I just want Consuming Flames, so I'm pretty low on this card in general. The fast spell is better. The ability to deal 4 damage to the enemy is nice, and you can do some things with it. At least it kills sites and does a couple of other interesting things. It's a little better at killing sites than other things, and that's what you use it for in an Expedition format if you want to kill sites. That being said, we have Addictive Schalke, so I don't see this card being played in Ranked Expeditions or Draft, and I don't think you should pick it in any of those formats. If you have a lot of tokens in Draft, this is worth considering. Basically anything where you need to sacrifice a unit and you actually get good entombs off of it, Soul's Fury can be a lot more beneficial, and Totemites tend to go pretty decently low, so the 0/4 in Draft is okay, but this is a low draft pick, it's a synergistic draft pick, and it's definitely something you don't want in your first pack, but you might pick up in your 4th. Teething Whelp, Mastery 2 Flying, Mastery 6 +3/+3. One of the stronger 2-drops in the set. overall. Like, it's just really, really good. It gets flying when you attack with it or when you defend with it. Both are really, really useful. And then it turns into a 5/5 dragon after it has flying pretty easily. Takes a little while to get there, but it is also a cheap dragon, and that's very important for a wide variety of dragon synergies that are really, really relevant in both ranked and draft. Like, if you're playing a ranked deck that plays dragons, you want Teething Whelp. If you're playing an expedition draft or an expedition deck that plays dragons, you still want Teething Whelp. And if you're playing a draft deck, you absolutely want Teething Whelp. And not only that, it's a really high pick. Like, this is a 2-drop that functions similar to Lethrai Ranger in the way that it can win the game on the turn that it's played. Basically, like, if your opponent does not have good responses to this, then this is going to become a 5/5, and it's going to rule their day. It does take a while to get online, but in draft, like, that is a while that you can generally spare because you have a really decent flyer that is not taking that long. It's 1 to 2 attacks after it becomes a flyer on turn 3. So yeah, on turn 5 you got a 5/5 for 2, which is definitely pretty decent. And if you use anything to boost the mastery, any sort of finest hour effect, you can at least skip 1 extra turn on that, and that's a really big deal. This card also carries weapons really well, does a lot of other useful things. Very, very strong draft card, very, very strong expeditions card, a little bit weaker in ranked, but because dragon synergy is so interesting, it'll probably find its way into a dragon deck in ranked. Warbrush Oni, each unit and weapon in your hand gets +1 strength. I was really down on this card, and I still think it's not a very good card, particularly in ranked or expeditions, but it is nonetheless actually a little bit more powerful than it looks. 2 is early enough that that +1 damage is actually relevant, and you'll often hit as many as 3 to 4. Like, it's just not bad for buffing up mastery cards and buffing up Onis in general. So you might play this in an expedition Oni deck. I think in a ranked Oni deck, it's definitely too weak, but expedition could feasibly run this card, even though it has that really very difficult 1 health and overall is not doing a wild amount of other good things. Not a high pick, even in Oni synergy, just because, like, overall it's not giving you a lot of onboard value, and the in-hand value is pretty neither here nor there. Might not work out very well. In draft, this card can at least buff up flyers, buff up mastery cards, buff up a wide variety of things. Giving extra strength to things is really important in that type of format. I would still say it's a relatively low pick for a 2-drop. It is nonetheless a 2-drop, so you might want to pick it earlier than some of your 4s or your 5s. Draconic Ire. Kill an enemy attachment, deal damage equal to its cost to the enemy player. Bargain, hit the enemy player with a dragon. I feel like bargain cards are undertuned by a pretty decent margin. I haven't seen a lot of them in Expedition. I haven't seen a lot of them in Ranked. I honestly even haven't seen a lot of them in Draft, particularly because if you pick one up in Draft, it seems to me, and it may just be a function of how the design of the card, how the UI is designed, it seems to me that if you put a bargain card into your main deck, you can't then put it into your market. It doesn't enable your market in a way that you can then put it into your market. It's possible there's some way around that, but it might just be like a UI thing. I haven't really looked into it too closely because most of the bargain cards are very bad. Draconic Ire gives you attachment destruction, gives you a little bit of extra damage on top of that attachment destruction, which is good if you are an aggressive burn deck. Unfortunately, you have to hit the enemy player with a dragon to get this card out of your market, which means you're probably not an aggressive burn deck. You're probably a pretty slow to mid-range dragon deck, and you don't really care too much about dealing damage equal to its cost to the enemy player because you have a bunch of big dragons. So in that case, you're probably more interested in cards like Boar, cards, any sort of like attachment destruction that comes attached to a unit, any sort of attachment destruction that comes attached to a unit like Stone's Melt Dragon, for example. So there's already another better market answer to attachments. If you want to run 2 attachment destruction cards, yeah, okay, it's decent on that front. I would say this card is reasonable in draft just because of the extra damage to the enemy player. Like, you often need to destroy attachments, and this can hit exalted weapons that are very, very big. But for the most part, this card's really pretty weak, and it doesn't usually go in the market as much as you would like. Most of the bargain cards are not very good. The green one's a little bit okay. The shadow one is actually quite good, but Draconic Ire misses the boat on most instances, and while it might eventually find its way into a ranked or expedition deck, the circumstances have to be pretty specific for it. Dragon Forge. Draw a dragon or weapon of your choice from your deck and reduce its cost by 1. This card's fun. It's a little slow for ranked, I would say, but in expeditions and ranked both, it's probably pretty reasonable because you can pick up weapons, reduce their cost, and get some decent benefits all at fast spell speed. This is the kind of tutor effect that could get really dangerous, and I can definitely see it belonging in a tier 1 ranked deck, even though it's not a card that has a lot of tempo or even like a lot of other things going on for it. The fact that it reduces the cost of the card and the fact that it is at fast spell speed, both of those mean that you can play it in some kind of control list, provided you can find the right types of weapons, or the right types of dragons if you are so inclined. We've definitely been playing this with dragon, and it's going to be a 4 of in most dragon decks. I don't know if that's always going to be right, just because it is a little bit wild, but nonetheless, it's decent. Yeah, I would say it's decent in draft as well, although you obviously do have to have good weapons or good dragons to pick up, but it, as a cheap tutor effect that also gives you the cost reduction, doesn't cost you any card advantage, just costs you a little bit of tempo. You're fine with that in a draft format. I think that's actually okay. Like the last major like tutor effect that we really had to worry about in terms of cost like this was like Celestial Omen. That cost 6 and was mostly unplayable in draft, but this is much, much cheaper. It effectively costs 2 in terms of like the overall tempo lost, and yeah, you get some decent benefits out of it. I would say this is pretty good in draft, pretty good in expeditions, and probably not great in ranked, but you could definitely find a deck for it. And depending on how good your tutoring is and how like well practiced you are with this card, could be very, very strong. Requires a really, I would say, carefully built deck to function well. But tutor effects are generally quite solid, and this might be one of the first really, really good ones, depending on how good dragons end up being and how good attachments end up being. At the moment, playing with all of the expedition dragons, I haven't found picking dragons to be as important as picking up weapons, but certainly there are a couple of good dragons you can pick up, and the other notable thing is that this card plays really well off of the 4/4 quick draw charge unit, which, yeah, we like that card a lot. That is just something that you can immediately do off of that card, and the one thing that card maybe had that it didn't get to do too often was play something with the extra power that it gained. So, yeah, it's pretty decent with Eclipse Dragon, and overall just seems quite strong. Funeral Pyre, deal 2 damage to an enemy, decimate, deal 2 damage to an additional enemy. So with spell damage, this ends up being pretty decent because you get effectively like a larger rock slide, and a larger rock slide for 3, even if you're losing the maximum power, is not that bad. Like you get some good damage out of it, you get to hit sites, you get to hit small units, you get to clear out a lot of targets and functionally hailstorm your opponent. In expeditions, this is going to be pretty playable. In ranked, it seems like it's not going to make it for the most part. In draft, this is also fine, also very good because you can clear quite a few units. The thing you have to be very careful about here is how often you decimate it. Frequently, you kind of have to worry about screwing yourself at 3 when you're decimating. So this is one of those ones where the decimate is really, really dangerous. And even if you're going to be getting value out of it, you might want to consider not decimating and just killing 1 unit with the Funeral Pyre. However, you can clear an entire board with this and leave your opponent just not playing units for a while. I saw the strength of this card in the event previously. I don't see it being played a lot in Expedition, but I think that in both Draft and Expedition it actually does have a place, even though it is a low pick in Expeditions and definitely a high pick in Draft, I would say, just because that damage combined with the ability to just clear 2 things is quite strong. You kind of need to play it with spell damage a little bit, but even if you are just running like some green-red with Decimate or something along those lines, the ability to do 2 damage to 2 different enemies is still pretty handy, and affecting 2 things at once is just generally a strong effect in Draft. That Decimate is very dangerous though, and if you misuse it, you will get punished for it. Gaudy Showman. Summon exhaust an enemy unit for 1. I don't see this card being used in expeditions or in ranked. I really don't like the card in general, but I have found it to be actually much better than it looks in draft. Like, despite the fact that it is a 1 health unit with 3 cost on it, which is just not that great, it does clear the way for masteries quite a bit and enable a lot of the mastery strategies. To that extent, like, yeah, it's playable. You definitely can pick it as like a mediocre pick in draft. Don't play it in expedition, don't play it in ranked, it's just not good enough. But like in general, these large units with lots of attack and little bits of strength are not very strong in most of those formats. That being said, this card trades really well in draft, and it's pretty decent at actually getting you the mastery you want to get going. It sucks removal up from the hand, and like even if you're sucking it at bad tempo, like that's probably something you want to do if you want to play into your bigger stuff, so it's not unreasonable there. You can definitely go for it. But yeah, I would still say mediocre pick for the most part. If you want to draft a lot of Onis, if you want to draft a lot of mastery, then yeah, go for this. And if you want to get just aggressive. Magebreaker, Spellcraft 2, play unexpected results. I would say this isn't better than like Sword of Ikaria in Ranked, and Sword of Ikaria was not good in Ranked, unfortunately, as much as it wanted to be. It really seems like a strong card in stats. Expeditions seems unlikely to see a lot of play. It's a little too deep in red, and the unexpected results, while a really useful ability, still requires you to play a 3-drop 3/2 weapon on your turn and play it for 5 to get that unexpected results. I think playing it for 5 is where the real value is. With a lot of the Spellcraft units, playing it for the full value is definitely usually a little bit better than playing it for the minimal value. But, you know, this card's at least average in Expeditions. You are trading with something, you are probably punishing your opponent. If it's a long game, then you can really hurt a control deck with this, and it's one of Fire's best tools, in fact, for dealing with basically any sort of control deck that has a lot of spells but not a lot of life gain. If one of those decks becomes a format staple, this is something you can definitely use. It's better than unexpected results because it provides you with actual onboard like setup, just because you get all of that like interesting option out of it. But you do have to play it for 5 on that front, and that's not something that a Fire deck often wants to do. But yeah, like against control, definitely not too bad. Maybe even play it like against like the unitless decks that are popping up in Ranked, but still a pretty steep cost for what you're trying to do. But fun, pretty interesting. I'm glad this card exists, and I think it is a pretty strong pick in both draft and just a mediocre pick in Expeditions. Razorwire Totemite, 1/1 Exalted Quick Draw. I don't like this card a lot. If you have it in draft and it dies to a sacrifice-based effect, then you get a unit that's kind of rough to deal with, but it's not like the 2/1 quick draw shadow weapon level of good. So yeah, I just don't think this card is very powerful. To me, it's one of the weaker cards in the set. You can certainly use it to generate some pretty scary cards, but like overall, that just doesn't seem like something that is likely to happen or really going to get you a ton of value. Most of the time your opponent can ignore Razorwire Totemite. Sometimes they can go around it. Every once in a while they can just like sort of let you get it and then silence your unit or break the attachment or do a lot of things. There are a lot of problems with Exalted that like people are getting better at solving, and the better they get at solving them, the more really low impact Exalted cards like Razorwire Totemite are just not going to matter. This card's bad in Expeditions, it's bad in Ranked, and it's still pretty bad in draft. This is one of my lowest picks in draft. So yeah, I wouldn't go very strongly for it, even though it's got some potential to win a game. Cinder Mota. Your dragons and treasure troves cost 1 less. Entomb, create and draw a 4/4 Cinder Dragon with flying. This card's proven pretty annoying in draft. It's also kind of okay in Expeditions. I've tried to play the dragon deck already with Cinder Mota, and my impression was that while the treasure trove reduction cost is kind of nice here, there are a lot of other ways to reduce the cost of treasure troves that's pretty decent, and even some better ways to reduce the cost of dragons that might be decent here. I'm just not sure that like this card is going to be super strong in Expeditions. I definitely don't think it's viable in Ranked, just because like it's so much cost for so little payoff. The nice thing about Cinder Mota is that the Entomb gives you the Cinder Dragon with flying. I believe that is still color locked, so you can't just play it and get it in a like Fire Justice deck. You have to actually get a Shadow thing. I hope they fix that soon, because the created card should definitely be playable for any player. It's possible they already have. I haven't seen it go off in a little bit. But yeah, in any case, this is a card that in draft tends to be a 4/4 dragon with flying at the very least, or even a card that allows you to prevent your opponent from attacking in with sacrifice units. It's a decent wall, does some decent effects. It's a mediocre to high pick in draft, especially if you have dragons to work with, in which case you can definitely do a lot with it. 6/6 Cinder Dragon is not a bad card, so playing this as a 6/6 Cinder Dragon definitely doesn't seem bad, and I actually like it a little better than the Cinder Dragon itself as a draft pick, just because this is something that gives you a little something on board and means you get to the flyer later on. In this case, the flexibility of the card actually might make it a little better than the flyer itself. So decently strong, not a high pick for me in draft, but certainly can be picked highly, depending on what your strategy is. Harmony of Flame. You get +1 power this turn for each of your units. Reduce the cost of each spell. Oh yeah, it's a 4/4. Yeah, 4/4 cost 6, not a 6/6 cost 4. I'm just, but yeah, like a 4/4 dragon. You get +1 power this turn for each of your units. Reduce the cost of each spell in your deck by 1. So yeah, overall this card is not going to do a lot, but there's probably a ranked or expedition deck that might break it. You can't really pick it in draft. There's just not enough things to do with it. Maybe reducing the cost of your spells could be cool, but yeah, like overall, I think this belongs in some sort of like glimpse spell deck or some sort of warp spell deck where you can actually do just a tremendous amount of spells played from your deck in some way. I think its potential to sort of reduce the cost of all of your cards is really interesting, provided you're playing a mostly spell-based deck. But also you need a bunch of units to get the benefit of the ritual out of it, so spells that play units. And we've done that strategy. We've already tested it out. It doesn't work amazingly well, but certainly there is the possibility for a deck to be tuned enough to play Harmony of Flame. That being said, real niche pick, probably not going to go in a ranked or expedition deck anytime soon. When it does, it might be decently powerful. Draft-wise, no. Just no. Relentless Combatant. Berserk, Mastery 8, +2/+2. Solid draft card that's not going to see any play in draft in expeditions or ranked. Just can't do it. Yeah, it's too low on stats. It carries weapons pretty well in draft and also is a good card to situate a Warhorn on because you already have the Berserk on it, and then it will become a 4/5 with a big weapon on it, which is certainly not a bad deal. Yeah, this card synergizes well enough with Warhorn that you get like a decent combo out of it. It's also a pretty predictable combo, so people might be ready for it or be able to prepare for it in some way. That being said, not an unreasonable curve filler, but obviously not a high pick. You don't really want 4 drops with this week of stats, but like if you need to fill the curve, go ahead and do it. Definitely don't play it in expedition or ranked. Tota Colony, a much better curve filler. 2/6, Mastery 4, create and draw 4/0/1 totemites. Mastery 6, each unit and weapon in your hand gets +4 strength and overwhelm. Not going to make it in ranked, but could make it in expeditions just because the abilities are pretty focused on lots and lots of value. If you get that Mastery 4, which is not too hard when you're playing with a 2/6 wall, basically it just allows you to really sort of create an interesting lockdown state, then attack in, use a Finest Hour, get a bunch of totemites. Not a bad deal at all. If you get the Mastery 6 off of this, the totemites are actually pretty dangerous and can kill your opponent very quickly. In draft, this card is actually pretty sick. I would say it's a very high pick just because getting that Mastery is insane. The stats on the card are great, and overall the card just does enough. The amount of value that it has is good enough for expeditions, but it's also a little tricky to navigate with 5/1 totemites. Probably your opponent's going to have a little bit more of a chance to sort of interact with that, and it's not going to be like the be-all, end-all mastery. You can't base a deck around this, but it is something that you could put in expedition decks with masteries or with other sorts of totemite-based strategies. There could be some interesting things going on here. Generally, giving all of your units and weapons Overwhelm is pretty cool. It's more about giving your relic weapons Overwhelm than about giving your totemites Overwhelm in expeditions, so that's the kind of thing that you want to build for. But yeah, this card's fine in expedition, bad in ranked, and very high pick in draft. So Warhorn, 2/2, when the wielder hits the enemy player, create and draw a 2/2 Oni Grunt. I am coming to believe that this is too slow for expeditions. The draw is the real problem there. The fact that it doesn't play the Oni Grunt means that you really can't establish a board with the card this week. It doesn't really give you enough stats on board to justify its existence. 4 cost 2/2 that doesn't actually get you another 2/2 means you're kind of competing with the 4 cost 4/4 that it plays Bar the Gates, and a number of other cards at 4 or 5 that just do a lot more in terms of weapons. This is a pretty weak weapon, and even if you get the Oni Grunts, you kind of don't want to play them. You almost want to trade them in, which makes their 2/2 stat line really not that reasonable. These 2/2s also cost 2, which means that they're pretty hard to play off of the Warhorn. Even after you put it on a Berserk unit, you're just kind of okay on units. This is something you pick late in the draft, or when you've already established a couple of Yeti Griffin Riders or other like Berserk Flyers. There are some cards that it does fit on that make it a lot more devastating in a draft environment, but if your opponent removes it early, then you are worse off than you were before, which is a pretty big issue, I would say. Overall, this card is not terribly strong in any of the formats, but it's a mediocre pick in draft. Burning Claw. 6/5. When one of your other Oni dies, draw each weapon it was wielding from your void. That is a decently sized unit for draft. 6/5 for 5 was a super playable card in the set 1 draft. Basically, Towering Terrazon was a staple of the format, actually. I really liked that card. I think Burning Claw is still quite strong in draft just for that really large stat line on that really cheap cost. Easy curve topper, does some cool things. The passive benefit is pretty reasonable. This card doesn't belong in Expeditions or Ranked, but Expeditions is weird, so maybe. Seems very unlikely. Low pick in Expeditions, absolutely unviable in Ranked, and then in draft it's just like a really solid thing to put on top of your curve. Dramatic Exit. Give one of your units +4 Strength and Exalted. Sacrifice it at the end of the turn. This card's very powerful in Expedition, provided you have the right synergies for it, and there's a lot of ways to get the right synergy for it. Works with Mastery cards, works with, let's see here, anything with Berserk is completely bananas with it. Piercing Grief, if you want to play Lifesteal guys, if you have something that needs to be sacrificed and has good entombs, something like, for example, the 0/4 that turns into a dragon. Like, there's just so many different things that Dramatic Exit can be used on. This is much better than Stand Strong in draft, as a good example of like sort of how effective it can be despite being a slow spell. There are some possible answers to it, but most people aren't going to do fast silences, so for the most part this card is usually going to get away with it, and when it does get away with it, it gets you a decent amount of value. A lot of what you I would say this is somewhat format defining for draft, and to that extent a lot of what people should be understanding about how to play around Exalted and how to sort of work with Exalted relies on sort of how they play around Dramatic Exit. So Dramatic Exit can be countered very easily, and there are a lot of ways that you can get some pretty bad results from it. The thing that you generally do with it is you sort of let the unit do its thing, or you block it with a cheap thing. Then you get the weapon put on your unit, and then you do something like bounce it with any sort of card that bounces, there are quite a few of them. You destroy the attachment, or you silence the unit and get rid of the battle skills. Silencing the unit usually doesn't work out as well as the rest of them, because there's still that giant +4 strength bonus plus whatever you had on the unit, but certainly notable and does some interesting things as well. Someone is pointing out that they muted it and it killed itself at end of turn anyways, which is generally consistent with how spells work. Not sure if that's a bug. I'm pretty sure that's how it's supposed to happen. So solid answer, but also you still do get hit with a very large unit. I would say this card is worth it in draft. It's not a top level pick, but if you have the synergy for it, it becomes a very high pick very quickly. So, all right. Flamekeeper. Exalted, Overwhelm, you have Overwhelm. Oh yeah, and Expeditions and Ranked. Doesn't go in Ranked, there's just not enough, it's way too much work, way too much cost. Expeditions, I'm pretty skeptical on that one. Flamekeeper, Exalted, Overwhelm, you have Overwhelm. This card is pretty annoying. I've found it to be even more annoying than Dramatic Exit in many circumstances. It deals a lot of damage, it's kind of hard to deal with in general. It's not the kind of card you want to silence because it's still kind of good at trading. Yeah, this card is nice if you have like a Grotow's Favorite or something along those lines, but if you don't have a good answer to it, it will kind of wreck your day. I would say it's reasonably high to pick in draft and could even be okay in Expedition just because it is a good Oni synergy card. In Ranked, this is too much work for too little payoff. Just not going to happen. All right. Living Mountain. Summon. Give one of your other units +2/+2 and Overwhelm this turn. That's a good enough buff. There's a 3-cost 3/3 that gives a +3/+3, and that is a stellar card in the draft format. This is a little bit of worse version of that, but it's still a reasonable option on 5, and I like it almost a little better than Burning Claw at 5. I think it's still not an amazingly high pick. It's mediocre. Yeah, I actually think it's a little worse than Burning Claw in some situations, but if you got the Berserk units, then you pick it a little bit higher, so it's about in that area. Overall, I wouldn't say this card is strong enough for Expedition or Ranked, but it is a really good draft card just because it gives you a good body and also gives you a good trick on the turn that it's played. Both of those things are relevant, and you get some good benefits out of it. But yeah, middle of the road draft, not very good in Expedition. Can't play it in Ranked. Slayer's Edge. Summon, draw a treasure trove for each different name among your dragons. So yeah, this is pretty decent. If you are prepared to pay for a very large amount of expense. I would say overall this card is strongest in draft. Expeditions is unhappy to play it, but it'll do it. Overall, I would say that the treasure troves are really, really nice, but there's a lot of power that you're playing for those treasure troves. You have to pay the 5 originally. The relic weapon that you get is not really worth the 5, so you're kind of not feeling so great about that, even though you get to remove something. You're in red, so taking damage to face is not something that you really want to do because you're already trading pretty consistently with your opponent, and just smacking one of your opponent's units in the face might actually lead to you getting killed down the line, which is not amazing. And then also, you still have to pay for all other treasure troves to get into your dragons, which could be an entire whole other thing. Yeah, I would say that overall this card's opportunity cost is pretty high, and that makes it fairly weak in both Expeditions and Ranked. It's almost completely unplayable in Ranked. I would say that you definitely don't want to do it. You want to work for that site instead, and Slayer's Edge is going to come in as maybe a market card, or maybe just not even a card at all. I don't know. I'm pretty low on this card. I think it's fairly low power. It is cool in draft and will typically get you at least one extra card worth of value, so you can do some things with it, but yeah, overall this card is just not doing enough, and it's not doing enough at the times that you want it to do enough. So I would rate this card very low in pretty much everything. It is removal in Expedition, and removal matters, even if it's at 5. So definitely take that, because it's removal with often an extra card attached, and that's a pretty good deal. But yeah, I think in every format I would actually rank it lower than Magma Javelin. That's sort of my impression of the card. Skyfire Hellkite. 7/4, flying. Summon each of your units, deal 1 damage to the enemy player. So decently aggressive Nightmare Dragon. You could play this in Expedition, I would say. It's got a really nice sort of damage attachment to it. Unlike Gunsmith, it is a unit that's relevant when you play it. So like it comes down at a time that's a little bit better than Gunsmith in some ways, and then it also deals a bunch of face damage. That's not an unreasonable market pick. Also, it is a large flyer, which means your opponent has to deal with it or die, so it's also not an unreasonable top deck. You could play this in Expedition. It's not a bad idea. In Ranked, no. But like overall, like this card is also just not one of the stronger dragons. There's probably going to be some other dragons that you want to play, but if you're playing a cheaper deck, if you want to play with basically dragons and you don't have a lot of other options, I certainly don't think it's wrong to include this card. I think this card can actually even roll some of the other bigger dragons, because some of the other bigger dragons are a little bit slower. So if you want to go for a more aggressive dragons deck, Skyfire Hellkite could actually be a reasonable card topper for you. In draft, it's quite nice. It's really, really aggressive. It's a little hard to play. You can't play it with decimate cards. Keep that in mind. 7s and 8s are a lot worse in the draft format, because decimate cards make it so much harder to reach 7 and 8. You'll frequently be tempted, and rightly so, to use the decimate, and that means that having basically anything in the 6 to 8 range is just pretty hard to reach, and sometimes almost completely inaccessible. So yeah, it's probably a good Expedition card, definitely a reasonably high draft pick, but it will definitely end the game in both of those formats, or well, it will be pretty likely to end the game in both of those formats, and so to that end, it's pretty good. Stone Smelt Dragon. I like this one a little bit better than Skyfire Hellkite, but certainly on the same sort of general page. Summon, kill all enemy relics. 5/5 flying, pay 7 to give Stone Smelt Dragon +7 this turn. So not as fast in terms of the immediate damage that's dealing to your opponent, but it breaks everything that they have that's a relic weapon or otherwise, so super strong card to play into a market. I would even see it in a ranked deck if you're playing with a bunch of dragons. Like, I think that getting something on board and killing all enemy relics is certainly a reasonable option. The main problem, of course, is that it does not kill all enemy attachments, so it's not quite as flexible as, say, a Passage of Eons, and that might keep it out of the ranked environment in general. But in draft, this card's strong in market, it's strong in main if you want to do lots of dragon forging, and yeah, it seems overall like a pretty powerful card. I would say that, like, if people are undervaluing this card quite a bit. That isn't to say that it's broken or even like aggressively costed, but it is a pretty nice rare that actually does a lot of good things, and you're happy to have at least one of either to Dragon Forge or to pull out of your market. And in that, it performs very, very well. The pay 7 to give the +7 this turn is something you can repeat multiple times, meaning that this card can kill your opponent in the late stages of a game. And yeah, it's quite powerful. You can do some wild things with it, and Expedition is happy to play it. Ranked, not so much, just too expensive for the cost. All right, and that is all of the fire cards. So that, yeah, it was about an hour. Cool to know. We are going to be talking about the other cards as well, so we're going to break this into different segments, but that is it for the fire cards. If you wanted to see the legendaries, we did do a legendary breakdown already for all of the different colors, so you can see that on the same playlist that this one will be on. To the YouTube folks, thank you so much for watching. Cheers. All right.